I'd like to welcome you all to the newest installment in Duke's Living History series. I'm Susan Tift, the Eugene C. Patterson Endowed Chair in Journalism and Public Policy at the Sanford Institute. And I'm delighted to have with us today Rick Kaplan, who is a veteran broadcast journalist. He's been in the business for 30 years and has held many, many distinguished positions. He has worked at ABC News, at CBS News. He was head of CNN for several years and has just recently, within the last month or so, taken over as head of MSNBC. We're going to be talking to him today about his career in broadcast journalism, but we're going to be talking just as much about the state of television news and also about the future of television news. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about you and how you get into the business.
My mother's favorite subject.
Right. Last night at the Sanford Institute, you were talking about your career and about broadcast journalism, and you said, I knew I wanted to be a journalist before I even knew that I wanted to be a journalist. Could you talk a little bit about what got you interested in the field and then why specifically broadcast journalism?
Well, I started off actually wanting to be in politics, and at least thinking that I did. And I worked as a precinct worker in Chicago for the Democrats, because if you lived in Chicago, of course, you were a Democrat. And it progressed to the point where when I was in college during the enormous upheavals and anti-war sentiments, in 1968 I went off on a weekend to campaign for Gene McCarthy, ring doorbells. Everyone had gone out to dinner when we had gotten to Sheboygan, Wisconsin, and I remember the phone rang. I was the only one in there because I was tired. And they said, well, who's in charge? And I said, well, I don't know. I just got here. Well, who else is there? I said, no one else is here. I'm here alone. And they said, all right, well, listen, Paul Newman's coming there tomorrow. It was not the most organized campaign. Paul Newman's coming there tomorrow. Can you take him around? Do you know anything about politics? And I said, well, for like 5 years, I'd been a precinct worker in Chicago. And they went, oh, all right, you're a pro.
Your experience.
Interesting, the definition there. But and the next day I organized 4 or 5 events for Paul, and including a rally. It's not real hard in Sheboygan, Wisconsin to ask people if you can bring Paul Newman over. And we had a very successful day, and I'd written some remarks for him because I'd asked, what the issues were that were most important to those folks. And I get a call the very next day because apparently Paul had said that this kid's great, whoever this guy is. And they said, you want to join our advance staff? Well, I'm not quite sure what that was, but sure. That sounds great. Beats ringing doorbells. It was freezing out. So I never actually rang a doorbell for McCarthy, but I started doing advance for the senator and doing advance for Paul. And, I ended up traveling to more than 40 states and writing lots of speeches and things.
Advance for Paul Newman. What a great job.
Not too bad, huh?
Yeah.
Not too shabby. But what happened really was, I thought, well, this is great. I'm learning politics on a national scale, and it's a cause, and isn't this terrific? And then you remember 68 was such a tragic year. Mm-hmm. I had run into Walter Ritter of the Ritter newspaper chain. And I kind of ran into him I didn't know it was Walter Ritter. He was there with his son and wife, and I thought he was just somebody there. I just thought he was someone who lived in the state, and I was perturbed with the senator that day for various reasons. And he said, I want to meet Walter Ritter. I want to see Gene McCarthy. Do you know where he is? And I said, yeah, I can take you to him. He's in his suite. And Walter said, oh, no problem. And Walter apparently knew. And I looked at him. The next day I get invited to this dinner, engraved invitation. And I show up at this dinner, and it's Walter Ritter and Gene McCarthy and Teddy Kennedy. We're running against Bobby Kennedy, I should point out, and John Fitzgerald, who was running the Kennedy campaign. And it turns out, that's when I find out it's Walter Ritter. I was the first kid who was ever polite to him in a campaign. And in a sense, he almost adopted me and started mentoring me. And he wanted me to work for Bobby Kennedy because he thought he liked Gene, I think, better, but he thought Bobby was going to win. And he said, you want to be with the winner because that'll be an extraordinary experience. And so we made up a time. It's a very long-winded story. You'll raise your hand when it gets
No,
totally
I mean,
dull.
but it's fascinating how serendipity
Oh,
sometimes involved.
serendipity is, you know, I had a cameraman who during a war once told me it's much better to be lucky than good, and
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of truth in that. But at any event, he arranges for me to meet Bobby Kennedy. And so I remember I wake up that day and I get an assignment. I have to write a gun control speech. And I don't know anything about our gun control policy, but I thought, all right, it's a liberal campaign. That means we're for gun control. So I thought this was pretty smart actually. I got law books. It was a speech to be delivered in Oregon. So I got law books from a friend in town who we would have explained the laws in Oregon, which talked about the laws in Oregon. And I'm thinking, all right, I'll see what the situation is, what we're supposed to do. And I'm way over my head. And I'm trying to write this speech, and I've warned everybody to leave me alone, don't bother me. In the afternoon, late, I get a knock at the door. And I'm going, what? And the guy goes, Bobby Kennedy is on the phone for you. Now, this is McCarthy headquarters. And I don't do accents. I wish I did. It'd be a better story if I did. But Bobby gets on it is Bobby Kennedy. And he's saying, well, you know, I can't meet you. And I just wanted to reschedule. I'm thinking, you can't meet me. All right. He said, well, you sound like you don't know. And I said, no, what? And he said, well, Martin Luther King's been assassinated and I'm going to Memphis. We have to reschedule.
Why? Wow.
And, you know, that was just a hammer blow. But then we rescheduled to meet the night of the California primary. And I'm on my way out of the hotel to go to meet Senator Kennedy, who had been rather an arrogant kid to on the phone, because it's kind of like, well, if we win California, I'll probably stay with Gene.
What planet were you on? But okay.
Yeah, but that's all right. Well, we won Oregon, and I thought we would win Oregon. And, you know, you're a kid. What do you know? I'm 20 years old.
I keep waiting for the word TV to come in here somewhere.
Well, you, as an advanced person, you work with TV
Right,
crews.
of course.
But so I'm on my way out of the McCarthy headquarters to go to meet with Bobby, because we've lost, he's won, and then he's shot. And it was just...
Well, so you're right in the middle of it, right?
Well, it's just, you know, it's kind of a Forrest Gump moment, I guess. Yeah. But I sat back and I went, what am I doing? Why do I want to be in politics? And I grabbed a blanket and a radio and went to the Santa Monica Beach in Santa Monica and sat there all night long contemplating my life, thinking about the things that I loved. What I loved was working with the journalists. What I loved was working with the film crews. I was fascinated by how all that went down. And I decided that night to go into broadcast journalism, that was the way, that was really the most effective way to help people, and and it was exciting and interesting, and I'd learn things all the time. And when I went back to Chicago, soon after I got a job at I worked the Democratic Convention for McCarthy. But when that was all over, and, you know, reality sets in, and it's after the election, and you do have to think about what you're doing with your life, I'm kind of going to school, and also, I mean, I went back to school at that point, obviously, and got a job at WBBM as a copy boy. That's actually kind of interesting, because I walked in, and they decided I didn't have enough experience. It wasn't enough that, you know, so I was smart and I'd done this or whatever, but I didn't have enough newspaper experience to qualify. Newspaper experience to be a copy boy.
Those were different days.
Indeed. And as I'm leaving, and this news director, who is a really dear friend, and you know, he's kind of walking me out saying, you know, go get some experience, kid, and come back, and, you know, graduate school and come back. All of a sudden we hear yelling in the newsroom. And the person who was the copy boy there had a nervous breakdown right then. And he looked at me and said, can you start? And I said, you got me.
This seems to be the story of your life.
Unbelievably lucky. So that was June 26, 1969.
And so you started at WBBM.
$83 a week.
When $83 really meant something.
But it was before taxes.
Right, yeah. Well, one of the things that strikes me about your story there is that you decided to go into broadcast journalism, I guess we would say for the right reasons. You know, you went in because you had this sense of wanting to change things, wanting to improve things. Do you think there's been a big change in the reasons people go into broadcast journalism? There's a whole idea of celebrity, a lot of money now, especially if you're
see, there wasn't obviously a lot of money then, because even the main anchor didn't make, you know, $100,000.
Yeah, I mean, were you typical, do you think, of people who were going
I
into
think I was typical of a lot of people of my generation. You know, I'm proud of the 60s generation, 70s generation.
My generation too.
Our generation.
Ours.
And I'm very proud of it, and I think but we also had great causes. We had a lot of things going on in life. But it was funny, I didn't look at it as broadcast journalism, because it didn't matter to me. I was going to hit the newspapers as well. What I cared about was journalism, and it was kind of neat that, as I said, the film crews and all that was terrific, but one of my, I don't know that he even knows this, but one of the people who I just marveled at watching work was a reporter for Newsweek. And
who was that? Do you remember?
Dick Stout.
Oh.
And I've never actually said this to him, but I really enjoyed his company and learned a lot from him. And Walter was my idol, Walter Ritter, and he was the publisher of the Gary Post-Tribune. That was his assignment for the Ritter family before they merged with Knight. And it was, for me, it was the covering a story and the writing of a story, and if I could put pictures to it, that was great. But I've never yearned to be on camera. It probably makes me better off camera anyways. There's a lot of reasons I shouldn't be on camera. But
you're on camera now.
I know. I wish there was a way to do this, not doing it. But you're a more effective producer when you don't compete with your correspondents and your anchors. And I've always enjoyed the content and the writing, and it's a mistake, I really think, that young people make all the time, and we all talk about it together. That
to want to be the on-air.
They either want to be on air, and that's their motivation for going in because they can be famous and they think make a lot of money. You might have a better chance making a lot of money in the NBA than you have making a lot of money in TV right now, because every year there's 50,000 journalism students graduating. And there aren't 50,000 jobs that open up every year. There aren't even 5,000 jobs. There aren't even 500 jobs that open up every year. And there's no telling, you're going to have to move all over, and you're going to have to work your butt off to get somewhere. But the most important thing, and it's lost on so many people, and we see it all the time, is that people don't write anymore. I get letters from kids, and this is a good lesson for you. I get letters from kids, and they're written horribly, or they misspell my name.
Well, I think that's a universal problem.
And
this generation.
Guess what? When somebody misspells my name or the letter is inarticulate, I throw it away. I don't care where they went to school, and I don't care what they did in the summer. And you talk to a lot of these kids, and they're not motivated for social reasons. And I'm not saying that you have to be a liberal, conservative, middle. I don't care. I mean, as long as you know how to leave it outside. But if you don't come in for the right reasons, then those evenings where you don't have a life, that's going to weigh heavy on you, and it's going to make your work a lot harder. There are great moments. There are times when I sit there and I go, I can't believe I'm doing this. I've done some really extraordinary, fun programs, had some great assignments, and I sit there and I go, you couldn't pay, to have this experience.
It's like being an eyewitness at history. I want to go backtrack for just one second to make sure, because our audience may not be people who've been in journalism. Could you just talk briefly about what a producer does as opposed to someone on air?
Well, my father used to think, the classic description of a producer is the guy who puts up the money for the show, right?
Right. Well,
so my father would say to me when I went to work as I was a producer for Walter Cronkite, and my father would say, "How can you afford to do that?" And I said, "Well, Dad, I'm not really putting the money up.
Like
CBS funds it. It's not a show."
Broadway.
In fact, Richard Solan, who was our president, said, "We don't do a show. We do a program. We do a broadcast." Very important distinction to him. And a producer really works with either a correspondent or an anchor, depending if they're a field producer or up through executive producer of a program. You are responsible for the content. Now, so is a correspondent, and obviously so is an anchor. But a producer's entire function is to make sure the report is concise, accurate. If it involves videotape and film, is it pleasant? Is it produced well? Is it structured properly? You're kind of you really are an editor.
So you're the equivalent of an editor in a newspaper
A copy
setting.
editor. Yeah. You're the equivalent of a copy. We also have editors who actually
do the
edit the tapes and films. But a producer would be the kind of a copy editor. But also a producer's a reporter. I've done, in stories that I've worked on, I've done half or more of the interviews sometimes within a piece. And you have to be a good reporter. The best correspondents are good producers. They understand how stories get put together.
I think a lot of people, when the viewing public anyway, doesn't understand, in fact, that a lot of the interviews that they see on television that don't have the head in the background of the person who's doing it, they're being done by the producer. They're
That's
not being
right.
done by the on-air.
And we
person.
we always say everybody needs a producer because it's kind of like, how many times have you been at a wedding or somebody's giving a toast and it's like, how much longer is this?
Yeah.
We always say, well, that guy needs a producer, because what a producer will do, since they have no vested interest in how long the correspondent is on camera and the rest, they'll try to give you the best product. In other words, we won't waste your time. You know, if it should be 4 minutes instead of 5 minutes, that's what it'll be. If it should be a minute and a half instead of 3 minutes, that's what you think it'll be. It's somebody to say to the correspondent, enough. You know, it's because everybody needs some help that way. Everyone, even
Right.
when a producer goes on camera, it's nice for them to have someone who just says, as someone on the, outside, not doing it, it's enough.
Well, it's true in print as well. Everybody
Sure.
needs an editor. Going back to being the eyewitness at history, you have been in the business for 30 years, from 1969 until now, and the events that have happened in those decades have just been incredible.
Yeah.
I wonder, if you could go back over those 30 years and pick out a moment or two that you're most proud of in your role as a journalist, what would they be?
I think I pick out two moments. It's not about pride. It's about, one is a telling moment and one is a prideful moment. So a telling moment would be, I remember I was at the White House when Nixon resigned and left.
In 74.
In 74. And I'm
August.
walking back from the White House with Roger Mudd. I was at CBS then. And I'm walking back with Roger Mudd and our bureau chief. The three of us are walking back. Bill Small. And we're walking back and I'm going, this is horrible. I mean, this is it. At this age, I've covered the most extraordinary story of my life. There'll never be another.
And you've been in the business 5 years.
And I've been in the business 5 years. And Roger laughed. He said, I will tell you, I was walking down this street exactly 11 years ago. Was new to TV. I had just come back from John Kennedy's funeral. I was new in the business, and I said, he said, maybe even to you, Bill, what have I got left to do now? I've just done the Kennedy funeral. I've
It's
just had
over.
a president assassinated. And they said, so hang in there, stuff will happen. They put it a different way, but instead of stuff, but stuff will happen. And I've been very fortunate in that I've gotten great assignments and been at extraordinary moments. I've been with Mikhail Gorbachev as he was negotiating with Yeltsin to leave office, and it was at a time when all the other journalists either weren't allowed in or the local journalists didn't want any part of the story because they didn't want to cover Gorbachev and infuriate Yeltsin. So I literally was alone in the Kremlin with the crew. Ted Koppel joined me for the last week or so because he was going to be the correspondent on it, obviously. And but I was alone in the Kremlin for like 3 weeks with just me, a bunch of Russian crews, Soviet crews, watching the empire disappear. I mean, I had I could walk anywhere. I spent time in the Lenin bedroom with the curator, and it turns out my political science professor was Lenin's best friend, so I brought him a book by my professor, and he gave me one of the pencils off Lenin's desk. I mean, it was an extraordinary, it was just really fun. But I think the time I may be most proud of, sometimes they're little things, but we had a producer. I was working on Nightline with Ted Koppel, which almost every day I can point back to as just the most fun in life. Ted's an extraordinary human being, let alone journalist. And the show's great, and the staff was even more superb. And one of the producers had pushed us, and we decided to spend, and it took a year to do it, we decided to go and take a look at a country nobody was paying attention to, South Africa. And
When was this, roughly?
85, maybe, 84. It's Nelson Mandela still in jail. P.W. Botha is the president. De Klerk was nowhere on the scene. Apartheid was strong. And they hadn't started the demonstrations yet. And we went there, and we had negotiated for a long time to get what we were going to get, which was 5 nights that would be broadcast on South African TV along with American TV. We thought it was very important to be broadcast in both places because we wanted whatever we did to be insightful and impactful, and we wanted a record of it. We wouldn't want to come and leave and people there had no idea what we were doing there. And we opened with an interview, a debate, if you will, that Ted moderated between Pik Botha, who was the foreign minister, and Desmond Tutu, who had just won the Nobel Prize. And because Desmond Tutu is obviously of color, not only did no one in South Africa ever hear him speak before because he was banned from doing that, but when he won the Nobel Prize, I think his picture in the paper was whited out. So you'd look at the paper and there's the Nobel scene, and there's just a figure that literally was whited out, like with whiteout, because of course people of color couldn't be seen in their white newspapers. And the two of them are debating. And it was an extraordinary debate.
And it was
historic. I remember being in the control room, and Pik Botha has a bit of an actor in him. And we always check them in. Let's make sure that they're not sitting together. That would be too much to ask. So we're satelliting both of them in from different parts of the country. And Ted, as he does on Nightline, is talking to both of them electronically, if you will, but the viewers at home see all three faces. But I remember we were checking in the satellite, and Ted goes, Bishop Tutu, do you hear me? Yes, I do, Ted. And Foreign Minister Botha, do you hear me? And there's silence. And there's silence. And it felt like an hour. This is in the pre-show. And he says, yes, Ted, I hear you fine. And it was like, oh my gosh. And then, now they had never met. Here's a Nobel laureate, the only one in his country, I think, at the time. And he had never met the foreign minister. They'd never spoken, nothing. And Ted said, and it was a historic moment, we should have actually taped it and put it in the show. Ted said, we always said to the guests, talk to each other so we can make sure you hear each other. And we said, would you talk to each other? And Bishop Tutu immediately speaks up and goes, yes, Foreign Minister Botha, how are you, sir?
Silence.
Silence. And at this point, we know he hears them. So at this point, it's like maybe Pik's deciding, I'm not going to respond to this man, right? Because that was a big thing. That, maybe Pik Botha thinks he'll answer Ted and never have to deal with Bishop Tutu, right? And there's silence, and he says, yes, Bishop Tutu, nice to speak to you. And it was like, oh my God, we're on our way. So we had an associate director working for us named Ria. I can't remember her last name. And associate director helped us. She worked for South African Broadcasting, and she was the interface, if you will. We had a lot of technical help from the South Africans because we weren't going to be bringing over 1 million cameras and all the rest. And so, and with the studios, and they helped build a set, and she was our person. And her husband was the son of the founder of the Broederbond. The Broederbond is the ultra-rightist,
right?
The heart, the core, the soul of apartheid. And it was like, Ria, you sure you want to work with us? Your husband can't be happy about that. She says, no, he actually said, well, if it's good for your career, go ahead and work with them. And so we said, well, we're dying to know what he thinks about what we are doing. And so the show we aired Monday night in the United States, aired Tuesday night in Johannesburg, in South Africa. I can't imagine how many people, but everyone the next day was talking, Wednesday morning everybody was talking about it, but we only wanted Ria's review because she gets done Tuesday night, she goes home, and she comes in Wednesday, and we said, so what did he think? She said, well, she lost her courage. He was asleep when she got home because of the time difference and when we'd have to do our shows. So she tried to sneak into bed to avoid a confrontation because she was just tired and had lost her courage to ask. And he woke up. He said, I saw your show last night. She said, yes. He said, we're wrong.
My goodness. Wow, that just really, that's the power of television.
Well, we all started crying when she was telling us the story because what an amazing thing. He had heard, the key moment, I guess, in the debate is Bishop Tutu says, I'm 57 years old and I've won a Nobel Prize and I'm a fairly responsible person and I'm not allowed to vote in my own country. What do you say? And truth be known, Pik Botha was a very fine man.
Yes.
Is a very fine man.
Right.
And, they have a very interesting view, those people who supported apartheid, and, there's no defending it. But it's not, some of them I found to be totally despicable, but some of them I found to be, I kind of understand where you're coming from. You're just wrong,
Well, we went through this in our own country. We had
Yeah,
our
we
own
sure
version
did,
of
didn't we?
that. Yeah, right. How did you manage? I'm curious. How did you manage to get South Africa to agree to have it broadcast?
Somehow, yeah, well, this is part of actually what I was just saying, in that they didn't think they were wrong. It's not like, well, we're wrong and we just have to cover it up. This is not like Watergate. They think this is what we do, and you'll see if we can explain it to you that we're right.
Oh, I see. So they thought it was in their own best
They
interest.
thought it was in their best interest eventually, and we explained to them that we would cover it in a very fair way, and we did. We actually assigned. It was funny. We had one correspondent to the of color perspective of what South Africa's about, and one correspondent to the white perspective, the white Afrikaans perspective on what South Africa is like. They're two extraordinary takes on the same country. It's kind of a Rashomon. And we dealt with them all very fairly, and I think they appreciated that, and we talked about that, and we didn't make any guarantees actually in the end other than being fair, and it took a year for them to get used to us and to get used to the two producers who we sent there to negotiate that, Betsy West and Tara Sonnenschein. And I think they were impressed with Tara and Betsy, certainly, and they'd learned about our program, and we met numerous times in Washington with their ambassador, and he saw Nightline, and he saw it to be the program that it is, and it took a year, but we got it.
Well, that's a remarkable moment.
Yeah.
I want to switch gears here for just a second. As we're talking right now, we're actually in a period of time of some upheaval in journalism in many, many ways. But the one I would like to talk about first is about ethics in journalism. As we're meeting here, Jason Blair of the New York Times was fired because of his plagiarism and faking stories and saying that he was places where he wasn't. Jack Kelly of USA Today has had similar kinds of problems. And broadcast journalism has not been immune to this as well.
Neither is cable journalism. I
Yeah.
had a situation at CNN called Tailwind,
Right.
where I go to your question.
Yeah, no, I just was, without asking you to tell tales out of
Well,
school
I'm
or anything
happy
like
to.
that, but just really to address the question of whether or not, over the 30 years that you've been in journalism, whether or not you see this as a problem that's become worse, or is it just easier now to detect it because of the internet? I mean, are people, in fact, in journalism lying more now than they did? I think the public perception is probably that way, but it may not be true.
Well, let's try to attack it, and you help me here if I forget to address something. First of all, let's understand journalism ethics. It's not about telling the truth and being fair. That's the ticket in. Journalism schools are not supposed to be there to say, as opposed to what you normally do, from now on you have to tell the truth. We assume you come to the table telling the truth, being fair, being accurate, all of that. We don't expect you to be unbiased. Everybody's got biases. We expect you to be able to put them aside. We expect that a trained journalist knows how to take that bias and get rid of it. Most people care more about being journalists than almost anything else. And I find, contrary to what Bernie Goldberg says in his book,
His book is called Bias.
which
It's
is called Bias.
About CBS.
Right. And I just think Bernie's got it wrong, because most journalists I know would rather die than put a slanted piece on the air. Moreover, in print and in television, it is such a collaborative effort. You're not going to get away with it.
You've got checks and balances.
Tons of checks and balances. And it's just, I know in my own situation I've had to live with charges because of being biased this way or that way, because you inevitably make long-term friends. I've been friends with Bill Clinton for 30 years. I would never think about doing him a favor. He would never think about asking for one. It's part of the mutual respect and friendship. Never talked about Monica Lewinsky and all the rest of that, because it's just, how do you bring that up with a friend? And it would have made me uncomfortable, probably would have made us less friends. And that was important to him, to keep his ties with old friends. But they were all personal. At any event, so you come in, we think, with a grounding in honesty and decency and fairness, and we teach you about bias and how to identify it in you and control it, and that's what you're supposed to learn. This is more a subtle thing, and here's, I think, what's happened with it. I mentioned Tailwind. That was a breach of journalism ethics, but it's a breach of journalism ethics in a different way. Nobody lied. I had producers come to me with a story.
Could we just backtrack and make
This
sure
is
our
a
viewers
story-
understand what tailwind
This was
is?
a story that that alleged that American soldiers, in rescuing MIAs, and some might have been deserters, but in going after the Americans we thought were being held in Vietnam, used poison gas, sarin gas, to immobilize an area, rescue our folks, and then they used antidotes to bring the Americans healthy again.
And this is
and
illegal.
the rest died.
Illegal, right, under the...
Well, certainly. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, it's not, that would make us,
in violation of...
we would be doing things that Saddam Hussein did, except
Right,
he didn't revive
exactly.
anyone.
Right.
Because we did kill the others who attacked. Three very respected people brought the story to me, said they had researched it. It was vetted by the chief counsel of Time Warner, a lawyer. And vetting is not checking. Vetting is, how do you know it's, that it's Wednesday?
Right.
Right? Prove it. So vetting is the most extreme form of checking. They vetted it, or they said they vetted it, and we put it on the air, and clearly they didn't have it. They didn't have it
nailed
solid
down.
enough. We
Yeah.
shouldn't have put it on. So I took a lot of heat for it, and should have. I was president, and a number of people were fired, and that was a breach of ethics because they should have known better than when they had some problems in the interviews, in that people were telling them one thing on camera, another thing off camera. And what we had to do is basically acknowledge that the story shouldn't have gone on. We didn't have it ready for air yet. Others would say it didn't happen and that's why you had to retract it, but I don't even know enough about that story to tell you it didn't happen. I mean, lots of things happened during Vietnam. I certainly don't know enough about it at this point to say that it didn't happen, and I certainly don't know enough to say it did.
Right. Some people
So it's just an
think
ugly
the jury's
moment.
still out on that.
But the breach of ethics was that we put something on that wasn't solid enough. That was the ethical breach. They had talked to people who, they had talked to people who on camera would say, it didn't, that I don't know anything about it, and off camera that would say, I feel uncomfortable admitting it, but it certainly had happened. And and this is what our producer's saying. It's like, you know what, when that's what happens, you have to discount those interviews. Sorry, and they should have told us that they had this problem, and then we wouldn't have aired the story. I think what's happening today is, first of all, I think people are less well trained. I think because everybody's trying to get their moment of fame, people are rushing to air with things that perhaps they shouldn't have. And more than that, in olden times, you would shoot a story, you'd have to ship the film, you'd have time, a couple of days,
Yeah, there's a
to
lag
check
time.
it out, and then you'd send your track in, and something would happen, and 2 days later the event would get on the air. Now we're live, and so people put themselves in the position of telling you more than they know. That's a real problem. And in the course of that time, with all this fragmentation and all the rest, and numbers going down, there's been added pressure to become interesting and interactive. And I think you get people who blur the lines between being a pundit and being a reporter, between real, honest journalism and just gossip. And they blur the lines for themselves too often.
Well, in many ways, what you're talking about is, I guess, what we would call the journalism of verification, where you actually get a story and you put it through this fine mesh screen of all the things we know about in journalism. We're checking for facts,
Yeah,
checking
it's
for
just,
accuracy.
I was going to say, it's just journalism. It's not anything, it's not journalism verification, it's just journalism.
Well, as
if it's journalism, you got to check it out, and you have to have and depending on the level of story, you don't need two sources to tell you that the Cubs lost today, but you
Right.
do need two sources to tell you that the president lied today.
Right, but as opposed to the journalism of assertion, I guess you would say,
Right.
which is what you're talking about with pundits. In a way, talk radio has now informed a lot of what's going on in cable, especially the 24-hour news cycle. Is that the kind of thing that's feeding this atmosphere in which people are charging left-wing bias, right-wing bias?
See, I think that would be, I don't think that's, I'm uncomfortable calling punditry journalism. It's journalists, and they're giving you learned opinion, and it's a form of expression, and it belongs on, television or cable. It's fine. But there's a huge difference between punditry and that kind of activity by journalists and reporting and news reporting and news programming or newspapers. And that's why there's a big difference between the op-ed page and the front page, or should be. And I mean, I remember, Wall Street Journal had days and days and days where the front page totally conflicted with the editorial page, even in terms of what they called a fact. And that can be rather confusing. I think too often, no spin zone or not, too often you get some of these talk shows. I think talk shows also have to have a point of view. And it doesn't matter to me if it's right, left, center, it doesn't really matter. I think probably 85% of this whole country is very close to center, either side, left, right, but we're not all that dissatisfied with the United States of America, at least sane people aren't. And while we have problems, I don't think we have problems that are in many ways as cosmic as almost the whole rest of the world does. So people are happy to be Americans, I think. That's a rash generalization, but I'm comfortable saying it. And I think that means you're not looking to make the extreme changes that people on the fringes want you to make. So I think easily 80 or 85% of the country is within 10 degrees of the middle. And then there are, the fringes in both parties. And it doesn't matter to me on a talk show as long as the bias is identified. And in fact, a talk show needs to have a point of view most of the time. There are great differences. There are great exceptions to that. Meet the Press. I have no idea what Tim Russert thinks. I don't know what Stephanopoulos thinks on ABC, although his background is such that a lot of people do have a feel. Although Tim Russert worked in politics as well.
Moynihan, right?
Yeah. And I don't know where Bob Schieffer stands personally, and that's fine. But the way they conduct their business, all three of them, you don't really know where they stand. And they get a pass, actually, because they'll bring on guests who espouse varying points of view, and they're held to task, whether they're on the right or the left. What feeds most of 24/7 cable now is, of course, very opinionated, and for the most part, the successful talk shows are right-wing, and that's fine. I mean, if you have a right-winger and he's beating up on a left-winger or holding his own with a left-winger or losing to whatever it is, the discourse is informative. And you do get, if the show is civil, you do get an idea of what both sides are talking about.
Well, I think that that's a big if, because I think a lot of viewers feel like what's going on right now is shout TV, and the decibel level is way up there, and it really has become almost like a sporting event as
Except
opposed to a
don't
news
give them
event.
more credit than they deserve. Not that many people watch. If Bill O'Reilly was placed against either Schieffer, Stephanopoulos, or Russert, and you compared all their numbers, Tim, of course, is number one in Sundays. But Stephanopoulos and Schieffer have far higher ratings than O'Reilly. And with the exception of O'Reilly and Hannity and Larry King on CNN, you have fewer people watching all three cables put together than used to watch color bars in the middle of the night on the network. I mean, the cable audience when it's all said and done, the average audience is less than 1 million. Total, all three.
But there's still a lot more buzz about...
Well, there's buzz because there's culture buzz, but there isn't necessarily that kind of buzz throughout the country. I mean, we tend to write and talk a lot about it, but the audience, the cable audience, is very fragmented, and the news cable audience is really small. Now, it should get larger, and maybe it will get larger, and maybe it deserves to be larger, but right now, their impact far outweighs their reach.
Well, looking at this from a viewer's point of view, I mean, we know the difference between, say, an op-ed and an editorial and a news story, and we know the difference between a talk show where there's, a bias involved and an actual news program.
Do we really?
Well, let me just buy that for a moment.
Okay.
But I think most viewers out there are now quite confused about what constitutes verified news. I know just with my own students, I was surprised to find that I had to explain the difference between an editorial and a news story. They just thought an editorial was a biased news story.
I think if you go back to your class, they will have trouble telling you the difference between Oprah and Peter Jennings.
Yes, that's right.
And Jon Stewart will be their major source of news.
Right, The Daily Show.
Right, The Daily Show. And I think that people are a bit in doubt. I'll tell you, even when you just watch some of these talk shows who don't want you to think that they're punditry, there are some talk shows that are arrogant enough to tell you they're the news, they're the real deal. They're the no spin zone. They're straightforward. Mm-hmm. And what always frustrates me about some of the shows is that the hosts will start out with an untruth. They'll start out with a fact that is not accurate.
And there's no one there to shoot it down or
and then they debate it for an hour,
yeah.
and you walk away concentrating on the debate, unaware that what they debated was a lie. Mm-hmm. I don't know what you do with that.
Well, what should television do with that? What should
cable do with that? Well, I believe in free speech, so what we hope is that the audience gets on to some of these people at a certain point, and you turn the dial, and those people get canceled.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the 30 years that you've been in the business, mm-hmm. has the definition of news changed, in your opinion?
Yes. News was more highfalutin in the past.
Serious.
Well, it was serious, but also, remember, when I started, people didn't know much about the news. When Walter came on and said, "Good evening," this is now going to be most people's first dip into the news. Now, people come to the set, and they have the internet, and they have video on demand on their cell phone, and they get headlines on their pager, and there's the internet and the internet and the internet, and they come to the set and they know pretty much a lot about what's going on. They've heard the headlines. Mm-hmm. There's 24/7 cable networks. They're maybe up in an office. They've seen the headlines, the crawl. They see, they get it. Hey, you didn't know what the scores of baseball games were till the 11 o'clock news, and now everybody comes to the 5 o'clock news knowing every score, because between ESPN and all those places that you can go, I mean, you've even seen the highlights already.
Well, then they should be better informed, not less informed.
Well, except if the stations and the networks, and this is my gripe, actually I think sports does it quite well and has figured out, sports fans don't have, if you're only going to give them the scores, goodbye. I think too often network news is only giving you the scores. And people are going, I know that, goodbye. And so network audiences have dumped by like 30, 35%. Over the 20, 25 years. And they just keep going down. Because I don't think network news has recognized everybody comes to the table knowing more. You've got to give them more than just the headline. They've heard Martha Stewart was found guilty. Now what? And you do have to report that, but you have to tell people more about it. You have to, every story is a diamond, and you got to give them more facets.
Well, to play the devil's advocate here.
Sure.
And I can't remember the guy who made this statement about, no one went broke, underestimating the intelligence of the American people. Martha Stewart is an interesting...
Well, you can't even remember his name. So if he was right, maybe you would have remembered his name.
Yeah, I guess you're right, yeah. But if the American public is so interested in finding out more and television is not giving it to them, take, for instance, a story that was on NPR today about Medicare going broke. Now, we know we've heard this story for years, but there's a new iteration of that today. Television news, as far from what I hear you saying, should be trying to drill down and to find an interesting way to tell that story. And I submit that I don't think many viewers, as important as that story is, would actually tune into that, no matter how interesting it may be.
Well, I agree, but I don't think that's the breaking news of the day. You're talking about documentary work. You're talking about long form. You're talking about every once in a while, which I do think is important, breaking news or not.
It doesn't have to be breaking.
They have to go look. No, but I'm talking about straight news reporting. Today we have 9/11 hearings.
Okay.
There's a lot that people will know when they come to your evening news about what was said, because they'll have heard highlights already. But what more can you bring to it? Mm-hmm. What can you tell them about, well, we've done some checking, and we've taken a look at calendars and White House whatever, in all administrations. And what can you tell us about the veracity of what they said? I mean, I'm talking about evening newses and 24/7 cables and the rest. And do I think the Medicare story belongs? I do. But I think it's one of those things that belongs in a mix that primarily starts with real reporting on what the news of the day is. Mm-hmm. That's where, see, if people come, you go to NPR because you get the news of the day, and you also get great insights into other stories that are of importance to you. And you're willing to give NPR a chance to tell you those things because you know it's not going to disappoint you. I mean, it may take too long to tell you, but you will get information you can use and take away. The problem with, I think, cables and networks right now is they're still mired in the 70s, where they're still really intent in giving you headlines. So you sit there and go, I know that, I know that, I know that. You know, I said in my talk last night, and I teach students that if you gave an audience from the 70s a transcript of an evening news and said, circle what you didn't know. I'm not trying to tell you, by the way, that the Cronkite Show was better than today's evening news is. I don't actually think it was. But the audience knew less about the news then. And consequently, they would have circled far more items in Walter Cronkite's newscast than they're ever going to circle in Tom or Peter or Dan. That means, better or not, the other show is more, the show with more circles is more compelling. You're learning something. There's more takeaways. It might be a more pleasant presentation. But networks have to come to terms with the fact that we can't just keep telling folks the same old stuff.
Well, again, to play
They have
devil,
to drill down.
Right.
It's a veneer of news right now, and that was a lot in 30 years ago, because a veneer was more than they had. But now they all have. They come to the set with that veneer locked, even deeper than that.
Yeah.
And we need to rethink what is news, in that you have to go beneath it. It's not, all right, so we know she was found guilty. She'll probably do 18 to 24 months. Is there more to tell us? Like, why did the Fed go after her?
Well, that's a good example, I think. Again, to play devil's advocate.
Sure.
The definition of news, many people say, is now softer, more personality-driven. Martha may even be an example, Martha Stewart, of that herself.
Well, that's a personality, but that's a story.
It's a serious story.
Better
as
is, Britney Spears made the news because she got, the
Knee
headlines
surgery.
of her marriage lasted longer than her marriage. And
Lacey
yes.
Peterson,
Well, all right, but it's a heinous crime, but it's overkill, isn't it? So pop culture and those purient things, they have an unnatural importance today, I think. And people, you can always get an audience to watch a train wreck. So what goes on right now, it's kind of like the car chases, that are inevitably happening in Los Angeles. And some stations put that on. And it's curious to watch. One day somebody's going to get offed in one of those, and your children are going to be watching, and then I wonder how happy you're going to be that
it happened the other day
car chase.
in Los Angeles. A
There
guy
you
was
are.
shot by police in the course of it on live television.
See, which is, it's appalling.
Yeah.
We don't allow that on MSNBC, actually.
The drilling down that you talk about, commendable, also expensive, right?
No. It takes intellect. I mean, it really does. Think about it. You're covering the Martha Stewart trial. What if I say to you, I know all that stuff, but why don't you just, instead of making calls about, can you tell me what it was like in the jury room, somebody else will do that, and we'll have enough of that. How about, let's call a different subset, and let's find out, what is it that she did that made the Fed go after her like that? Or why don't you make a couple of calls and find out, so what's happening with Skilling and Ken Lay and all the rest of
Well,
them?
that just sounds like basic good shoe leather reporting.
Thank you. And is that really radically more expensive than what we're doing? No.
No, but many
harder.
stories are not these kinds of stories that require investigative skills. I mean, the Tailwind story is a good example.
Yeah, but that's a big, long-form operation, and that's not the breaking news of the day. In the breaking news of the day, generally it involves saying to a reporter, all right, we kind of know those basic headlines. What more can you tell me? Most reporters come to the table and they know a ton, and they give you just the cream off the top because that's all they have time for. But what if you say to them, what I don't have time for is the cream off the top. We know that already. We'll say that in the intro. Martha Stewart was found guilty today, whatever the heck the charge was, and she's going to do 18 to 24 months, but it opens up a can of worms about X, and here's so-and-so, And that's more informative to people because they know the first part.
Well, okay, let's just say I buy your argument, But there are many, many critics who say that the increasing conglomeration that's happened in media companies, the emphasis on the bottom line because these are publicly traded companies, has made it much more difficult for news organizations, such as the ones you've been associated with, to do even that. How do you respond to that? Cost cutting, eliminating positions?
Well, you got to remember, we're in a business.
Quest for ratings.
We're in a business whose ratings have been dumping.
Yeah.
Now, if you were making light bulbs instead of news programs, you would say after 25 years of dropping sales, why don't we look at the light bulb and maybe we're not making it right? And if their ratings were going up, you wouldn't have this, would you? But maybe the ratings aren't going up because not just that there's other sources of information or other distractions, fragmentation. Maybe network numbers are going down because either the entertainment programs are horrible or the news programs are not informative. You know, NPR in the same period is up 400%. Mm-hmm.
And a very elite demographic, too. One would think advertisers would be interested if you had it transferred to a
that
commercial.
kind of advertising on NPR.
Right.
But basically, what you've got here is, it's kind of like, don't give into it. This is a call for more, for a sterner look at what we do. You can't keep doing business the same way you've been doing it for 35 years when the audience you're attempting to serve doesn't come with the same needs. Mm-hmm. I mean, like in any product, you have to consider the needs of your consumer. And if their needs aren't for the headlines, then why are you surprised that you're not selling?
The Project for Excellence in Journalism came out with a report in the last week, 500-page report that was somewhat pessimistic in some ways. It said the only areas that were growing in journalism were ethnic, online, and alternative press publications and organizations. That cable was flat and that broadcast evening news, as we all know, the numbers have been dropping.
But remember, you know, there are 30 million people who tune into the evening news every night. Mm-hmm.
Still a large number.
Yeah, considering that there's 1 million people who watch cable news at the same hour. Mm-hmm. So the network news audience is 30 times larger than the cable audience.
So you're choosing the glass half full?
Well, I'm saying that we're making a light bulb that needs to be redesigned. Mm. And I'm saying that there's a lot of news viewers who are finding that they don't spend their time wisely watching the news reporting that goes on everywhere. You know, when you sit back and marvel at the intelligence of a network, it's like after 9/11 when all those great journalists sit there and say, well, you know, who, what, when, where, why? And they start doing those traditional journalism things, and you start to say, well, look, we're going to tell you about a group called Al-Qaeda, and we're going to tell you about this, we're going to tell you about that, and we're going to show you how this works. I mean, all of a sudden you're back to being a reporter again, and this is all news stuff to people, and everybody loves what the news does. Now, that's a very dramatic story, and I understand that there's threats involved with it to your safety, and it's compelling, and fine. But in just general news reporting, there is so much more that we can do that would be more compelling for people, and much more pleasant, much more satisfying for the journalists doing it. Journalists doing the news today aren't all that happy with what they're doing. So there was more joy in the newsroom when I started than there is joy in the newsroom today.
Does it get back to that reason that you got into it in the first place, which was to try to do something that was going to change things as opposed to covering sometimes things that seem more light?
Look, I walked through the I don't know what you call it, but it's not the quad, but I walked past, I walked from here to another housing area, and there's a mission statement on a rock in an open field. And it reminds me that every great organization, news is no different, needs a mission statement, and then you have to pay attention to it. And Bill Kovich, excellence in journalism, and noted journalist and educator, tells you that journalists need to serve the needs of their citizens. That's what the job of a journalist is. Their mission, his or hers, is to serve the needs of citizens. All right, so if that's what you're going to do, and you keep that in mind with everything you do, you sit there and you finish the story and go, am I serving my citizens' needs? I'm telling them stuff they already know. How is that serving their needs? Maybe I need to go deeper. You need to do that. Producers need to do that. Anchors need to do that. Reporters need to do that. It doesn't cost more money to ask a better question or or to write a smarter story. It doesn't cost more money.
Let's get to MSNBC, since you've just
Sure.
taken over MSNBC. As you yourself said last night, you're actually like number 3. I mean, there's Fox, there's CNN in terms of ratings, and then MSNBC. How are you going to take these ideas that you've just talked about, which sound terrific?
Well, we're
and
going to
apply
try.
them?
We're going to try to apply them. I've got enormously smart colleagues. I'm very gratified by it, and we're going to try to push to see if we can make that work. We're in a good position to do it because we're last. And if you were in first, whether you have a falling audience and you're just falling slower than the others or not, you're loath to try to mess around with something that's in first. But we're not in first, so we have nothing to lose by doing this, and we have nothing to lose by doing what I think is the right thing and far more serving of viewers. So if we sit here in a year, maybe you'll see the results of that, which is a higher viewing level. If nothing else, we're going to work very hard to make our presentation more informative, and we're going to report more stories and more about those stories, and hopefully there'll be stories that you come to the set going, that's important. I need to know that.
Could you explain to our viewers how MSNBC differs from the other cable networks? I mean, you get reports from NBC.
Well, we're the only network.
Do you do your own original report?
Yes, we do. We're the only cable network, if more than affiliated. We're owned by a broadcast network. And we're a joint venture with Microsoft, who is mostly responsible for MSNBC.com, our website, one of the most heavily used websites in the world. And what we do, we have reporters who work just for us, and we have reporters, but they could work for the network. They get their checks signed by NBC. But we have reporters assigned just to MSNBC. We also have reporters that we use who are signed to NBC, which covers MSNBC and CNBC, the business cable. And so we have a great advantage, I think, over CNN and Fox because we have this broadcast platform and all these correspondents and a great tradition. More than anything, there's an extraordinary tradition of fine journalism at NBC, and that counts. That institutional pride counts. What we also have, because of MSNBC, we have an extraordinary amount of original reporting that goes out on the web from their journalists and their people. We also have editorial relationships with Newsweek and Wall Street Journal. So we have another 2 sources, and we haven't used those sources enough yet. So part of making this work is to use the Wall Street Journal and Newsweek and MSNBC.com and to use that to greater advantage.
One of the things the Project in Excellence in Journalism study said was that there's been an increasing tendency or trend for news organizations to emphasize the distribution of news as opposed to the content, the actual generation of the information in the first place. And from what I hear you saying, you're kind of doing a bit of both. I mean, Wall Street Journal content, Newsweek content, your own content, but really a distribution platform.
I'm trying. It's not about distributing it. It's going to be distributed on MSNBC. So it's not about the distribution, but it is about where we bring, what resources we call upon to make that distribution, the product in that distribution, more satisfying and more informative. We have a lot of ways to go with that. CNN has an extraordinary organization around the world, and they do what they do. They have 8 networks. 7 networks. They have an international network and a Spanish network and an airport network and a headline news network, and I think for them too often the news is just it's a commodity. I know this firsthand, having been president. It's a commodity to be sorted out amongst the 7 networks. So we have one product, one network, and many more places to get input from. So we should do better, and we're going to try.
Well, as we're meeting, we're in the middle of a presidential election year.
Beginning.
Yes.
Isn't it amazing? We haven't hit the conventions yet, and we're talking about being in the middle.
I know.
I mean, we should be at the beginning.
Like it.
Yeah,
I feel like the conventions have already
happened. We just finished the primaries, right?
But as usual, the criticisms of the press in the past are the criticisms today. Too much horse race coverage, too much personality coverage, not enough drilling down to see what the candidates' stands really are. Always looking at the attack. and trying to keep that kind of story
And,
going.
and it's a proper criticism, and it's a fatal criticism, because the one thing we know, and I think just think about your own personal life and your friends, if somebody is a reader of newspapers and a watcher of television newscasts, I guarantee you they're into politics.
And why do you say that?
It's just been my experience. I've never met anyone who reads newspapers avidly and likes to watch evening television newscasts and is not into politics. And therefore, if you do a poor job of covering politics, they think you're a jerk because it's something they're interested in. So that's going to be our first challenge, is to cover politics in a way that will impress people.
So, and how are you going to do that? That's different from.
Well, I'm not interested in little signs. You know, the horse race is a much maligned and wrongly maligned style of reporting. It does matter who's up and who's down and where they are, and if the election were held today, knowing the election isn't being held today, that's still an important thing. But I think you can get away from, 5-second sound bites, and I think you can get away from a lack of substantive reporting, and I think that you can do more in that area and really bore down into issues and bore down into campaign commercials and the charges that they bring forward, and take a look at the accuracy or exaggeration that exists in each.
Which is something newspapers are already doing.
Sure,
Yeah.
and I think we can do that on TV. I have a 24/7 network. I don't have to kind of wind around entertainment shows here and there. That's one of the great things for NBC. They have a commercial network where their news programs are, limited in how much they're on the air, but they have a resource in MSNBC and CNBC where if things need more reporting, we can do it. And we have an extraordinary website where you can even do more.
What about things that in the past, I mean the distant past anyway, have been sort of traditional staple fare of political coverage, like covering the conventions?
Conventions used to mean something. They don't now. And I am a real naysayer about covering conventions, because I'll tell you, all the candidates are picked. They're staged events with, it's an enormous commercial for each party. It's not even an exercise in democracy. And nobody watches it. And it costs a fortune because, frankly, to do anything at a convention is very expensive. It costs, because of all the extra charges, and we won't go into that. But it is so expensive to do anything there. And for what? It used to be, we didn't know who the candidate was. There was going to be a floor fight.
Right, there were smoke-filled rooms.
The platforms were being argued about on the floor.
Dead people in Cook
But
County
there was an
were
event
voting.
going on.
Yeah.
Now it is just it's a crappy entertainment show is what it is. And nobody watches it. And so I'm not going to spend $4 million to do the two of them. If I had my druthers, it would be dip in coverage here and there and not spend a lot of time with it.
Which is what most of the...
I think all the networks feel pretty much the same, although we don't collude, so
Right.
I don't know.
Although
I was head of the political unit at ABC, so I know what they're doing, and I know what I'm doing.
Let's pull away for 1 second and talk a little bit about war coverage. We've been through a period of time here where there's been an unprecedented amount of coverage of the invasion of Iraq, because we had embedded reporters for the first time, at least in our lifetime.
You know what? We've always had embedded reporters, but now they were officially embedded.
Right, exactly. They were reporters at D-Day, so we know.
Right.
But I wonder if you could do a little Monday morning.
There were reporters in the Civil War.
Yes.
There were reporters in the Revolutionary War.
I know. Just not at Grenada.
There were probably
Grenada and
exactly.
Right, but if you could do a little bit of Monday morning quarterbacking about the coverage and the quality of the coverage of that, did that work to the viewer's advantage, to citizens' advantage, to see what was happening there?
I think it did. I think, because it was officially done, people were suspect of it. But the truth is, I think correspondents felt the same kind of freedom and latitude they had felt when they talked their way into, hey, let me come along with your unit. I've been in 8 wars altogether, and I don't think our correspondents felt less freedom or more confined in this one. And the thing you have to say to some of these reporters, some of whom were out there for the first time, so it was quite a new experience, is all you can report about is what you see and what's happening in your clique of land. You can't if you're having a bad day, the war still may be going well. And if you're having a great day, the war may not be going well. And so it's tell us what you know, don't take sides, don't do something stupid, like give away the position of your unit, no matter which side you're on, by the way. And so there are certain rules about all of that, but it's just, report it fairly. I don't think it's in the country's best interest if we can only report good things about the United States, because after all, we're at war. An American journalist covering America in war, it's difficult.
Well,
you are rooting.
Right.
However, rooting doesn't mean that if things are going badly, say it's going well, become part of a propaganda machine. The truth is, I've always found that, that a democracy does best when it knows what its problems are, and a country like this overcomes them. So I think honest reporting is helpful. But I think Embeds did a really fine job.
Well, you mentioned war reporting in previous wars, and I've always wondered whether or not if there had been television cameras that could do the kind of thing that they did in the Iraq situation, whether there would have been cameras at D-Day. Probably not, because they would have seen.
Well, there were cameras at D-Day,
right,
but we didn't have technology for live
exactly,
cameras.
to send it back live the way we did.
Well, I did a Nightline on the 40th anniversary of D-Day. What if D-Day were fought with today's technology? Mm-hmm. It's a great show. You actually ought to get it into your library here. We used just using the historical documents. We went live to Berlin, and it's a great show. We had Eisenhower's son, Stalin's interpreter. I mean, it was really an extraordinary experience. But I think, look, the reason we had these embeds is because in the last Gulf War, when the military, the government had been heading in a direction called keep the press out, because their experience in Vietnam was they think somehow the press caused the Vietnam War to be lost, which is absurd. And so the reaction to it was keep us out of things like Grenada and the rest. And then all of a sudden the military came back and said, we had an extraordinary victory in Iraq.
And no one was there to see it.
And no one was there to see it. Nobody knows just how well we did in 1991. And they knew we were going to do better in this one. And they said, well, we can't hide that. I mean, this is the might of the United States, say the military, and we ought to have witness to it. Instead of what happened last time, which is we're scared to death, and we're like a recruiting ad. We're doing so well. This is the military talking. And so that's why there were embeds, which is extraordinary, because they knew they let the press, they changed their minds. Rumsfeld and company changed their minds about how it would be done. Because he was part of the people who authored Keeping the Press Out. But they changed their minds and let us in, and then to be surprised after the hostilities kind of wind down, that they're not, and not to be prepared for the peace is extraordinary.
Right. Well, I'm afraid we're running out of time. But
darn.
Darn. But this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you very much for sharing your experiences with us.
Thank you.
And thank you.